Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is Jonathan Haas. How are you today?
Wonderful. Beautiful day in New York City.
So, you are a New York City legend. You've done incredible things over your career. We're going to get into some of those things, but I usually like to ask people, what is your first musical memory?
Well, my first musical memory that I would say has had effect on me in terms of where I am right now and what I do, my parents, who were very forward thinking parents in the city of Chicago, took me to the Ravinia Festival, which is a summer festival that takes place in the northern suburbs. And they took me to Frank Zappa's first concert tour with the Mothers of Invention. I think I was 13 years old. I may have the math a little bit off, but I remember sitting in the Ravinia Pavilion, and Ainsley Dunbar was running around in the audience. The band was dressed in clothes that I wasn't aware of that even would qualify as clothing, somewhat like costumes. And I experienced Frank Zappa at a young age. And I said to myself, not my parents, I want to do this for the rest of my life. Everybody was just having so much fun, but more importantly, the music that they were playing was transformational. It was inspiring. And that moment was a decision that I made for myself. I
That's
want to
amazing.
drum.
Your parents took you to a Frank Zappa concert. Were they really forward thinking in that way?
Their desire in parenting was to give my sister and I as much exposure to as many different things in life. Neither of them were musicians, but the idea that music and the arts were important and remain so was something that they shared with me early on and has always stayed with me as an artist and also as a parent. They also took me to the ballet, which I did not like. The Joffrey Ballet would come and it wasn't necessarily my thing. I also would go to the Chicago Symphony with my grandfather, and that's where I learned that chewing gum was a great way to keep yourself from falling asleep. Although my grandfather, Simon, always, didn't matter if it was a Mahler symphony or a Beethoven symphony, always took a little nap in the slow movement of the piece. So I'd look over at my grandfather and I'd close my eyes too. And we're both chomping on Wrigley's spearmint gum while taking a nap while the Chicago Symphony is holding forth in some of the greatest repertoire ever written.
That's great. My son sometimes starts tapping his fingers on the table or whatever, and I start to join in, and my girlfriend's like, "Could you guys please stop? It's making
Oh,
so
yeah.
much noise." I understand that your sister did that to you.
Yeah, but mine was much more severe because at a very early age, my sister Jody told my parents that she was going to be taking me out of the family if I didn't stop at the dinner table playing on the pots and pans. And my parents took her quite seriously, bought me my first practice pad and put me in the basement. That turned into a Slingerland drum set. And at the time, it was blue agate. That was the color. Amazing. That I bought at Frank's Drum Shop on Wabash Avenue in Chicago. But
Still
it
have
was
that?
I still have it. Of course, we all have to have our first drum set that's with a smoothie hi hat.
Smoothie hi-hat. What's that?
Oh, the smoothie. That was Slingerland's nod to innovation in hi hats. And it was called the smoothie, and it's on the pedal itself. If you ever see one or have one, it's a collector's item.
Mm.
Um, and it was one of the first smooth hi hats. They had Teflon bearings and stuff like that. So instead of the main pole sometimes hanging up, this one worked really well and was called the smoothie.
I gotta look that up when we get done with this.
Yeah,
That's interesting. You went down in the basement. You had your practice pad. Your Slingerland drum set, right?
Slingerland, because my teacher was Jake Jurger, and Jake Jurger was a Slingerland artist.
Mm.
And those were the days where you would align yourself with the manufacturer. You know, Buddy Rich did it. Jake Jurger, who was a Chicago gigging drum set player, taught in the high school, which is where I studied with him when I was in high school. So if your teacher was with Slingerland, you bought a Slingerland drum set.
Was it a 4-piece?
It was a 5-piece, and I bought it from Maury LaShawn at Frank's Drum Shop in Chicago, which was the legendary drum shop, maybe of all times in the world.
Mm.
Now you can see Frank's Drum Shop, not what it really looked like, but in the Blues Brothers movie with Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, they drive a car through the front of Frank's Drum Shop in one of the scenes. Now that wasn't Frank's Drum Shop because they were on the 5th floor of a building in downtown Chicago. But
Okay.
that did immortalize Frank's Drum Shop, and Maury LaShawn's son at the time had become friends with Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. And so they set up like a whole bunch of drum sets in the window, and the Blues Brothers drives their black sedan through the front window, through the drum sets, and it's an iconic scene in the Blues Brothers.
I got to watch that again. I haven't seen that movie in so long.
Oh, it's so funny, though.
Basement, were you practicing along to records?
Oh, yeah.
What were you listening to back then?
Oh my gosh. Well, so I'm a baby boomer, so I'm from the 60s. So I was playing with the Doors. I was actually in a Doors band early on when I was in high school. So it was the Doors and Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. And interesting, somewhat to my own story, this is the time where I also became familiar with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, ELP. And that was probably my very favorite band at the time. And I ended up playing with them. And so it's one of those cycles of life in which you could never, ever plan for it. And then when it happens, you pinch yourself and you go, oh my gosh, I'm playing with my heroes. So it happened to me, and it can happen to anyone.
When you met Carl Palmer, what was the first thing you said to him?
Well, Carl Palmer, at the time that I met him, we had to audition for the Emerson, Lake and Palmer World Tour. So there was an audition in New York. When I met him, he had just recorded the Bach A minor that's in the Goldenberg School for Mallets. And it was on the ELP record. And so what I decided to do in my audition to go on the tour was to play the Bach A minor. And I did. And like Carl, he jumps up and he goes, wow, I can play that too. And so he takes my mallets, and, I had already heard his recording, but there I am with my idol. We're both playing the Bach A minor together, octaves apart on this marimba. And during the tour that we went on, we had a number of occasions to hang out because he had timpani in his setup. He had all the orchestral stuff. And he was very interested in approaches to how do you really play the instrument. He had learned a little bit of how to play from James Blades. And Blades was the iconic percussionist and teacher living in London. So we had these wonderful opportunities just to hang out and talk about drumming and what he did. And every night I played with him. The show opened with Bolero in 4/4, as we all know. Bolero is written in 3/4, but Carl had it arranged in 4/4 with his drum set coming up on hydraulics, and the drum set's on fire. So they figured out how to light the tam-tams and the drum set. So he's spinning around, and I'm playing Bolero in 4/4 with a spotlight on me, and he and I are doing it as a snare drum duet. Now, here's what made it really interesting. The Emerson, Lake and Palmer tour with the 60-piece orchestra that I went on is in the Guinness Book of World Records as being the loudest sound system ever built. We were going at 1,000 decibels. I don't know. It was likened to standing next to the jet engine of the SST, which was the supersonic airplane. So it's the two of us, only the two of us, playing Bolero in 4/4 through the loudest sound system ever built. And I have to tell you, I never had so much fun. It was incredible. It really was.
So, did you damage your hearing at all during those years?
No, no. Well, if you didn't have earplugs in, it wasn't really possible. It was so loud,
Mm.
but the bass got into you. So when we would be done with a show, you sort of felt like you lost weight because you were getting shook up through the whole show, and the audience just, we're playing in stadiums to 50,000 people. They
Wow.
loved it. They loved the volume and all that, but no, you had to have ear protection or you would have been deaf, damaged beyond repair. Everybody wore earplugs, yes, and still
When
should.
Yeah, that's true. I went to a club the other day and I was, friends of mine were playing. I'm like, I gotta find something to put in my ears. I'm like, I feel like I don't
Yeah,
want to damage
yeah.
this. You only have two ears. But I speak to several of them. They have very, very a lot of interesting stories because they've lived longer and they've been around for a while. But there's kind of one thing that most of them say, and they have one thing in common, is this specific event that happened on TV. I think it was 1964, the Ed Sullivan Show.
The
Were you
Beatles.
were you as blown away by them as everyone else in that time period was?
No,
Really?
here's why. The screaming that was going on and the screaming and yelling of the fans, right? I mean, it was
Hmm.
adoration. It was not meant to be disruptive, but you had the baby boomers, and it was especially the girls who were somehow so infatuated with this. So the studio audience in the filming, they were all screaming and yelling. So they did Hard Day's Night, I think. Don't quote me on it, but that's my recollection. When I'm 13 years old or something, or just a teenager. But the yelling detracted from. I actually wanted to listen to it, and it was also the same problem when I went to the movie Hard Day's Night. You sat in the movie theater, and this is the first time in the history of cinema people just screamed every time through the whole movie.
Mm.
And I eventually ended up sitting in the back, and just it was too much. It was too much adoration, and it wasn't enough. Let's listen to the music. Now, that the Beatles were not responsible for that. They caused it. So that was my first reaction, which was not so interesting. But I'll tell you, the Ed Sullivan show that I found so compelling is when the Who played, and the drummer, was it Pete House? He
Keith
played
Moon.
guitar. Keith Moon. Keith Moon trashed the drum set on Ed Sullivan and also lit it on fire. And this was on television. Now, as a young kid, I'm thinking to myself, whoa, that's really interesting. It's theater of the absurd. It was, theater and smashing the guitars. And for some reason, I had a fascination with how art and theater then became partners in what was going on the stage. This was a whole new experience.
So the Who was a departure. Well, not really a departure. That was what you gravitated towards. Were you in like the early 70s? I guess Tommy came out in the mid 70s. I
Yeah.
can't remember when it came out. Were you still into the Who at that time? And
Oh,
did
yeah.
you see that as like, okay, this is, you know, I shouldn't say, well, this is where I want to go, but were you really into that? And was that something that, well, I should just let you explain.
Right. Well,
How,
it's not being into it, but it was being fascinated by. And what Tommy is the equivalent of the Romantic period of classical music. Richard Strauss wrote some of the greatest tone poems. Don Juan, Till Eulenspiegel, Death and Transfiguration, and these were symphonic works that told a story from start to finish. Tommy which of course was called a rock opera, had many of the same aspects of it. It was a story being told. So the Who went from somewhat of the shock and the theater just as a vehicle to capture the attention of the listener to full on storytelling, which is what Tommy represented. And it was one of the first in terms of this sensibility of, even within rock music, a story is told. So I've always stuck with the Who. I remain a fan. I listen to mostly 60s radio and XM, and all the memory juices are flowing. You remember who your first girlfriend was, and oh, I was at a shock hop when the Doors had Light My Fire became this breakout hit, and all that great stuff. It's what music does. It also triggers our memories and our recollections. I love that part of music and what it does for us and with us.
You know, I said before we started recording that I like to ask my colleagues a lot of questions and intriguing questions. And I started thinking about music schools and how there's the conservatories, there's other music schools, and there's classical and jazz. When you go to certain colleges, you tend to focus on one thing. It's like, I'm going to study jazz, and it's all about jazz, and from Louis Armstrong and ends at Miles Davis. Nothing after that, nothing before. and you can't listen to anything else. Now you yourself have a long career playing classical music and all kinds of things. Do your colleagues look at you and say, why are you listening to the Doors? Why are you listening to that stuff? Do you have that kind of backlash from time to time?
No,
Okay.
no. But I say no because our makeup as a musician, I think that the more experiences that we have throughout our musical lives are what makes us the musicians that we are. And I've also and continued to investigate my interest in rock and roll, jazz, and right now with hip hop. I spent all of COVID in one of the deepest dives I've ever taken into hip hop, and came out the other side. That's all I wanted to do was I wanted to be a hip hop timpanist. I wanted to, because I heard timpani parts would work so well in so many hip hop pieces. You know, I'd listen to Pooh Shiesty and I go like, I could put a timpani line in there. And so when I came out the other side, I contacted my good friend and colleague Lenny White, who not only is the most iconic drum set player in the history of music, but he's also an amazing composer. And he and I met at NYU, both professors there, and began a discussion, finding out that he has written a lot of symphonic works. He actually has an opera that he's been thinking about doing. So when we found that common ground, I went to Lenny and I said, Lenny, I want to play hip hop timpani. Can you write me a piece? And he goes, yeah, easy. So he and I have been collaborating on a hip hop project that has sort of gotten a life of its own, to the extent of I felt that when the piece was done, it's called Algorithm Takedown, that we needed a visual to go with it. And I contacted a friend who I hadn't seen in 20 years, who's an animator, Alex Spadowski. So he made an animation. We put it all together, Lenny's music and the recording session, and our rapper, Walter, who lives in Indiana, and came up with the lyrics and did the rap. And we sent it out to film festivals because it had the animation. Well, get this. We've won 8 International Film Festival awards for Best Video, Best Animation, Best Music. And we have now been accepted by the Academy to apply for the long list for the Academy Award.
Really?
Yeah, we're like, all I wanted to do was play hip hop timpani. The next thing I know, we're in film festivals, but that's the musical life. You can't predict necessarily what the outcome is going to be. And more often than not, through serendipity, things happen and you never even planned them.
Mm.
So I find that my own interests have always led me to many different art forms, just not classical, although that's basically what I do. I've tried to expand it. I've tried to push on the ceiling, so to speak, of where can our instruments go? And it's
Mm.
limitless. It's just going to keep going in different directions.
I did hear that track, by the way, and I'm born in the 60s and grew up with the beginnings of hip hop. And that track is really good. I gotta say, it's really good. I was like, whoa, I think there needs to be more timpani in hip hop.
Well, Lenny is a genius. I mean, his compositional chops are unreal, and of course, as a drum set player, there's none
Hmm.
better. I got the right composer to write the right piece.
So if you grew up in the 60s playing drum set, listening to The Who and ELP and Frank Zappa, what brought you to playing percussion and getting into classical music?
Well, I was very fortunate. I grew up in the northern suburbs of Chicago. I was born on the south side. When I was 3 years old, we moved north. I went to a high school called New Trier, and they had an orchestral program at this high school. It's unbelievable. My sister was the principal cello, by the way, the same sister who sent me to the basement, or I was going to be uh, made to leave the family unit. And so I played in an orchestra throughout my high school days, and that's where I was exposed to Sibelius and Beethoven and Mahler. And for a high school orchestra, we were doing really, really advanced music. I really liked it. I enjoyed it very much, and sort of that's how it put me on that path.
And you went to college to study music.
No, absolutely not. I went to Washington University in St. Louis, which was a 6-hour drive south of Chicago. I'm a Midwesterner. I want to leave the area. At Wash U, I was a liberal arts major. I was interested in continuing percussion. So what had happened is that somebody sent my mom a article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about a percussionist in St. Louis, Rich O'Donnell, who at the time was the principal percussionist of the St. Louis Symphony. It showed him teaching at Washington University in St. Louis. My mom said, well, if you want to keep playing drums and doing your percussion work, Wash U seems to be a really good school because maybe you could study with this gentleman, Rich O'Donnell. That's what happened. So I got into Wash U and I became a student of Rich O'Donnell. It wasn't until my sophomore year at Wash U that I decided I wanted to be a musician. But my whole freshman year, there was no thought of at all ever that I was going to pursue a career as a musician.
Wow. You never did it ever cross your mind?
No,
Fascinating.
no, not at all. Well, no one in my family, no one was a musician. So there
Hmm.
wasn't prior knowledge. My father had gone to the University of Michigan on the GI Bill. He had fought in World War II and came back and was educated at UMich. And it was in business administration. So, that my family's experience was one of supporting the arts and having the family be exposed to it, but they didn't know anything about it. So
Hmm.
you can imagine the day I called them up and said, oh, I'm going to be a music major. They went, what's that? what do you mean? What would that, entail? But they were always very supportive and understanding. So no, there was no thought in the world my freshman year. In fact, I came back to Chicago and sold Encyclopedia Britannica in Evanston, Illinois to Northwestern students. And that's how I made some money selling Encyclopedia Britannica. I was a
Mm.
door to door salesman for a summer.
Do you think that skill helped you out in other endeavors?
Probably so. And certainly, in order to do something like that, you had to go beyond your comfort zone because back in those days, very much like vacuum cleaner salespeople, you would literally knock on somebody's door introduce yourself. This is when Encyclopedia Britannica would get leads of people who had sent their name in from a magazine advertisement. If you're interested in this product, write your name down, da, 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 da. So they were selling those, they called them leads. So they would sell to the salesperson, which was me. You would pay for the leads, and there would be a $1 lead or a $3 lead. Turned out that's against the law. Encyclopedia Britannica got shut down as a result of selling leads to their salespeople.
Wow.
I'm not a lawyer or a labor lawyer, but you go door to door, and you know what? It did help my career because it was really an interesting experience, because you met friendly people who wanted to understand what it was that you're selling. They sort of had asked for that information.
Mm-hmm.
So, puts you in contact with other people. You learn how to be nice to anybody and everybody because you want to make your sale. And it also taught you about the need to be knowledgeable about what it is that you're selling. So somebody might consider buying it. Well, think about that from the standpoint of musicians that we are. It's the same thing. You have skills, you have knowledge. Somebody doesn't know you. You're trying to convince them, I'm going to be a good sub for you on Broadway, or I'm the right person to go on the road with this show. And as we all know, interacting with contractors and music directors and things, there is self-selling and confidence. So once again, I would say, yes, it's a life experience. And so many of these experiences are portable. You can take them and the outcomes anywhere you want. And music is one of the most portable vocations to have, because what we have to do, you can take into any industry, anywhere, and it will have value and purpose.
Selling encyclopedias, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do after you got out of college?
Yes.
And
what
what was that?
happened? Well, what happened is I got the music bug when it was suggested to me by a game theory professor who had seen me playing at a concert at Graham Chapel, the Washington University Orchestra. He had called me into his office, and I was in a game theory class with him. Very complicated mathematical class, which to this day I didn't understand a thing he was talking about, but that was okay. So I thought he was calling me in because I was failing or I hadn't handed in homework. And the professor says to me, I think I saw you playing a concert last weekend at Graham Chapel with this orchestra. So the professor says to me, it looks like you were having a lot of fun. I said, oh, yeah, I love doing playing drums. And he said to me, well, why aren't you majoring in this? Why wouldn't this be something you would do with your life? And my answer was, I never even thought of that. And he said, well, you ought to think about that, because if you found something that you enjoy doing in life, he said, I recommend you try doing it. And that was the phone call to the parents that night. Hi, Mom, Dad, I'm going to declare a music major. Great, sweetheart. What's that? What are you going to do? So I did. I declared the music major. I had a lot of catching up to do because I wasn't at a conservatory, right? I wasn't practicing 6 to 8 hours a day. I was dabbling. And when I declared the music major, I also made a commitment to my teacher at the time, Rich O'Donnell. And he gave me the confidence. He said, you apply yourself. You work hard enough and you get enough experience and knowledge, and I know you will be successful in the things that you want to do. And so I got to work. And as a result of that, and my teacher believing and seeing that I was following his pathway, he had me starting as a substitute percussionist with the St. Louis Symphony when Leonard Slatkin took over the orchestra. And now I'm playing with one of the major orchestras in the United States, if not the world. And I went, this is for me. This is unbelievable. I'm having as much fun as anybody could have. I'm being challenged, and they're paying me to do this. And as a young kid, when somebody gives you your first paycheck, we all know what that feels like. And you go, you're paying me to play the drums. What could be more awesome than that? Because there's nothing wrong with being paid as a musician. We all need to be and ought to be, and as much as possible. And that's not to say we do this to make money. It's just a byproduct. And if you want to have a family and own a car and be able to pay for your gas, they need to pay. They need to pay you for your skills and for your dedication. So that was the impetus to find the final chapter in my education. At that time, I say final chapter because there were no DMAs or PhDs in music. They didn't exist. So it was a master's degree. I became a student and friends with the other members of the percussion section in the St. Louis Symphony, and told me that I should leave St. Louis and go to New York City and study with their teacher, Saul Goodman, because all three of them, Rick Holmes, Tom Stubbs, and John Cassica, were also members of the St. Louis Symphony, were his students at Juilliard. So they said, get out of St. Louis, because if you stay here, you'll play as an extra percussionist for as long as the music director likes you. And the moment there's either a new music director or the one who's present, and they say, I don't like that percussionist anymore, for whatever reason, they said, you're out, because you're here because we've brought you in, but we don't have the power and authority to keep you employed and engaged by the St. Louis Symphony. That's at the will and the whim of the music director. Now, people listening to your podcast, knowing that this is about Broadway, will say, that's like being a sub on a Broadway show. Now, if it's your book, and they can't do much about that unless you're not fulfilling the obligation, but we all do. But as a substitute on Broadway, you're only there at the whim or the will of the music director or the. So the situation in St. Louis for me was very much like the one that still exists on Broadway. I chose to take their wise words. I auditioned for Mr. Goodman at Juilliard, and I got accepted. Bye-bye, Midwest. Now it's time to go east. And I did.
You went to Juilliard.
Yes, I did.
And your move to New York. I remember Stevie Wonder's song that had a little section in it where a guy was saying, New York City, skyscrapers and everything. Were you in awe of New York in the early mid-70s, I guess?
Absolutely not. I did not want to come to New York City. In 1976, the bicentennial, New York, especially 42nd Street, for those who remember it, it was a war zone. It was one of the most dangerous places you could possibly go. New York was really filthy dirty. And so I arrived at the time in which the gentrification and the change of the Broadway area, mostly as a result of Disney's influence on that particular street and others. But when I got to New York, it was a pretty crazy place. The subways, it was crazy. Now, I was deathly afraid of coming to New York. So it wasn't like I was making some value judgment. I just, I was from a little town called Chicago, and next to Chicago, New York is a behemoth. That quickly dissipated. But my first week or two was, well, for the lack of a better description, was frightening because I didn't understand it. That was the only reason. Nothing happened to me. In fact, everything great happened to me. I was meeting New Yorkers, and I was eating cold noodles and sesame sauce. But you got to understand, for a Chicago kid, pasta has got to be hot and it's got to have meatballs on it. So the idea that you're eating food from a different country, that was very foreign to me. And I give the credit of my non-worldliness to growing up in the northern suburbs, not as a detriment, but just as that's where I grew up. And we did not have cold noodles and sesame sauce, which to this day is my favorite dish in all of the universe. But when I first had it, I went, there must be something wrong with my order because the spaghetti's cold. That's called naivete.
So when you eat that, you go right back to Times Square in 1976 with Mayor Abe Beame and the seediness of it. You know,
Oh my.
I ask people sometimes, do they like the New York of the 70s and 80s where the rents were cheaper, there was more creativity, you could survive easier as a musician, or the New York City of today where the rents aren't cheap, it's harder to survive as a musician, and there's less creativity, but it's a little bit more safer. Do you like the New York today or the New York of 1976?
Wow, that's a really good question. My first response to you was your really accurate characterization of what the scene was musically for me, because there weren't as many people wanting to do. By the way, Broadway at the time was the cemetery shift. That was the lowest common denominator. That was, you really are a loser. And there were great musicians on Broadway. So this is not a disparagement of the musicians. It was the sensibility, because if you were going to sub on chorus line back in those days, you would never come watch the book. You would just show up and do the best job you could. There was no listening to the book. There was no, oh, come in, look at the book, come in a couple of times, study it, watch me play it. It was, you get the call, hi, I can't make it in tomorrow. Can you come down and play the show? Sure, I'll give it a shot.
Really?
So it was a really different world. And I don't think that in the times that we live, I don't think it's any better, and I don't think it's any worse. Yeah, it's more expensive. But when I arrived in 1976, for some musicians, it was incredibly expensive and almost impossible to live. One of the manifestations and reactions to this was the reason that the housing that was built on 42nd between 9th and 10th Avenue, 8th and 9th, that was built basically for musicians and artists who could not afford the New York rents at the time.
I can't remember either, but I know what you're talking about.
Right. And that was the first thing where the city was saying our musicians need support. They need, along the same time came the need for practice spaces. And I was the first tenant in the music building at 38th and 39th and 8th Avenue. And back in the day in which I first moved into the music building, being the first tenant, wow, that was a war zone. That was a crazy place. I'm glad it got cleaned up.
When you finished college, you decided to stay in New York and expand your horizons in the orchestral world. Did you want to play in the New York Philharmonic? Did you want to be the principal timpanist? And what was your next step?
That was our goal when we were at Juilliard at that time. We all wanted to play in orchestras or a contemporary music group. One of my classmates was Danny Druckmann, who is presently and has been with the New York Philharmonic for a really long time. His focus, for instance, was playing with contemporary music groups. He was the original member of the New York New Music Ensemble. I also was getting involved with a group called Musical Elements and then Music Today. These are all contemporary music ensembles. So it was pretty much a combination of wanting to be an orchestral musician. That's what we were training. That's what we were studying. And then on the outside where we were working was either doing a Broadway show or subbing, playing in a contemporary music ensemble, and also doing jingles, as you mentioned. That was really the heyday. Unfortunately, the end of. I was at the last 15 years of the recording boom, and then the whole thing just absolutely evaporated. But that was the goal, to get an orchestra job.
What was your introduction to Broadway, and who got you into it?
Well, my introduction to Broadway was through first my good friend Bill Mersch. Bill Mersch he and I met at the Aspen Music Festival in school where we were both students together. It's a really good example of how the relationships that we make and the other colleagues that we're going to school with and having these experiences, they stay with us for a lifetime. At the time, Bill had been at the University of Michigan. He graduated and came to New York looking for the New York dream of successful musician. So he started early on getting shows in New York through the public theater, because the public theater, they were doing shows in Central Park. And Bill found the pathway into that world at the Delacorte Theater, Pirates of Penzance, and shows like that. And since we were really good friends, I was bringing him, because I'm going to Juilliard, and he still wanted to be in the percussion world, chamber music. So I brought him into that world. So the two of us are helping each other. And he had a show called The Suicide. It was not a big hit, but so he had this show and he asked me to sub for him. So this was my very, very first time subbing on a Broadway show for the show, The Suicide. Okay. So the setup is, his setup was such that the audience, he could just reach out and shake somebody's hand, the shape of the pit, and they put him not in the pit, but up on one of the levels that, like the dress box or something. And so I'm subbing for him first show, and you hear, okay, 60 seconds, curtain up, and I'm nervously waiting for the curtain to go up. And unfortunately, in my storytelling, I want to make sure I use the word unfortunately. The gentleman in the audience who was like right in front of my setup, he has a heart attack and he dies.
Oh no, really?
So I'm playing the show, The Suicide. It's my first substitution. And now there is a person who has unfortunately died right in front of me.
Oh no.
And the paramedics come in and so it somewhat of a sad story, but I have to tell you, it was very jarring and upsetting, but you know, had to concentrate. Show went well. So that was my introduction to Broadway. And I'll tell one more story because this one's really good. And it's one of the reasons why I actually did not pursue wholeheartedly a Broadway career. And this story will probably reveal that. But Bill Rule, one of the iconic Broadway percussionists, and who I remain very good friends with, was playing Pirates of Penzance with Bill Mersch. And this was at a theater. This was the Linda Ronstadt version. So this was the first time a rock and roll star, Linda Ronstadt, took on a Broadway role. And the setup was that on each side of the stage, seen by the audience, was the timpani book and the mallet book. It was marimba and boobams that Bill was playing. And it was one of the most infamous books on Broadway because Bill was a virtuoso marimbist, still is. And the book required a marimba soloist to play. It was so complex. And Bill's part was the timpani book, which was of interest to me. So I told Bill, I'll sub your book. And this now is a point in which we're studying the books. We're not recording. We don't know to do that yet. We don't have devices. The Walkman had just been invented. So there weren't ways to really record. You couldn't bring in a Wallensack recorder with your microphones. Be that as it may. So I'm first show, first act. Now there's a bit in the Pirates of Penzance where there was this huge bass drum that's played by the timpanist once or twice in the whole show. And on top of that bass drum, there was a cymbal. And there's a bit where one of the pirates during one of the scenes, comes over with a theatrical sword, and because there's a pirate scene and they're all fighting, and he hits the cymbal on top of the bass drum, and it's a great bit, gets a big laugh, and the audience loves it. This takes place in the first act, Pirates of Penzance. Oh, and by the way, this was at the Uris Theater. So for those theater geeks, it was at the Uris, which got renamed something else. It's where Miss Saigon went into. But this is the Uris Theater. So I'm playing my book, minding my own business. The pirate comes over and he does the bit. He misses the cymbal and hits me on top of my head with his sword and he splits my head open while I'm subbing on the timpani book, which, by the way, thanks to Bill Rule, if he's listening, that was a tough book. I mean, that had one of the first books where there's a lot of pedaling and all that. So now I am bleeding from the head, and I look at my hand covered in blood, and I say to myself, okay, I have a decision here I got to make. What am I going to do? So I decided you had to climb down a ladder to get to the timpani book in the Uris Theater. I stopped. I climbed down the ladder, and the house contractor was a gentleman. His name was Marty Grupp. Marty is running towards me now, saying, "What the heck are you doing?" And I show him my hand, which is now, and by the way, the wound was no big deal. All right. So in the storytelling, but you get hit in the head and you got blood on your hand. You go like, am I okay? So I show him I go, I just got hit on the head with a sword. And he's going like, oh my God, I don't know how that could have happened. And are you okay? And I said, well, I'm going to stop the bleeding, and I'll go back and I'll play the show, I'll keep going. And I said to him, however, somebody needs to tell that actor, if they come near that drum again, I'm going to go home. And he didn't say it like I was angry, but I said, I'm going to go home because I don't want my head to get split open again. All right. So the first half, I go back, the first half goes very, very well. Everything's fine. And now it's intermission. I climb down the ladder, and now I see 6 people walking towards me underneath the stage. It turns out it's the company lawyer. It's the head stage manager, Marty Grupp, a union official from Local 802, and a paramedic.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, what's going on here? And the lawyer, first thing is, are you okay? And we're very sorry. And is there going to be a problem for us? I actually didn't have the wherewithal to figure out. They were coming down because they were worried that I was going to sue them. And I'm like, no, I'm okay. And the bleeding stopped. And the paramedic looks at the top of my head and says it was a flesh wound. And so everything was hunky-dory. But I did say to myself at that moment, I'm not sure this Broadway stuff is the right pathway for myself. And although I did play on Broadway for many, many years after that, only as a substitute player, I did keep that in the back of my mind. This could be a really dangerous thing to do with one's career. And that's the reason. Sorry for the long story, but I thought your listeners would enjoy something like that. And everything I just said was absolutely true.
That is crazy. And
yeah,
it's man.
Right.
But
and
yeah,
I almost had my own.
Yeah, exactly. I know you almost got killed, man. Dangerous job. So subbing, it is very stressful, and you've done a lot of subbing. Tell me, obviously, well, before we even go on about this whole Broadway thing, did you start the NYU Broadway Percussion Seminar, and what made you start that? And tell me why you started that particular seminar.
Right. So director of the program at NYU, Lawrence Ferrara, a very smart gentleman, incredibly influential in the music world. He says to the faculty, when I came onto the faculty, I would like everybody to consider a summer seminar that would be appropriate for high school students to come and see what we do, visit the school, and then get some really good information. I thought long and hard about what sort of seminar would be different from what was already on offer. What was on offer in New York is you could come and study symphonic music as a high school student. You would go to Juilliard. They have a wonderful summer program that still exists. MSM, Manhattan School of Music, they may have had something going on. So I looked at the area and I saw that nobody was doing anything about the Broadway experience. And all my buddies had Broadway shows. Everybody had a show at the time. And that's where I got the thought, you know what we're not studying, we're not celebrating, is the art form of playing a Broadway show and the music that goes along with that. So that became the NYU Percussion Seminar. And we did it the first year. And it was a smash hit. Kids came from all over the world, literally. And we ran it for 15 years. Unfortunately, it's been paused right now due to some logistical issues at the school, but we're still working on reoffering it and bringing it back, hopefully. Over the 15-year span, we were able to impart to over 400 high school students, young folks who are our future. And some pros came too, by the way, and college age students. So it wasn't just high school, but it truly had a deep effect on many young people's lives and interest in becoming a musician. And especially the goal of, well, I want to do a Broadway show, or in the hometown that I live, I want to play Broadway shows. Part of the journey was early on, I had invited John Miller, the iconic Broadway contractor, to be a part of this seminar. And what we would do after, the students would come gather on a Sunday night, and then Monday, Tuesday, we would study Broadway shows. They would play parts of a show for the likes of Joe Pizarro or Clint DeGannon or Corey Grossman, Charlie Descarfino. The list goes on and on. I apologize for literally almost the tens of folks who presented. Javier Diaz, who's now on our faculty, Josh Samuels, who's on the faculty at NYU. So then on Wednesdays, we took the seminar, all the students, into active Broadway pits. So they watched the show while it was going on. And then in the evening, we would switch and they would see the show from the audience standpoint. In the middle of the Wednesdays, between shows, we would go to Local 802. So they would learn about unions and about Local 802 and the Federation. And that we would meet with the president of Local 802. It was a 4-day intensive. And at the very end, we'd have a round table. And John Miller would come in. I think one year Mike Keller joined us, but for the majority of them, John was with us. And we'd sit in a circle with the Broadway percussionists who they had just studied with, heard them play their shows with Miller in the room. And these kids got to ask them all the questions that they had on their mind about playing on Broadway, being a musician, their lives, their trajectories. And to be a part of this was actually a great honor for me to organize this and to be a part of it. And we affected a lot of young people's thoughts about what they were going to do with music. And it was really fun too. So that's what the seminar was. And that's how that came to be. The outgrowth of it was 15 years into doing this and it being very successful. I was sitting in a lunchroom at Carroll's at a rehearsal, and lo and behold, just out of coincidence, John Miller's got something going on in one of the rooms. I'm a contractor as well. So the three of us end up in the area where you can eat your lunch. And I'm talking to Miller, and I said, hey, John, maybe we should think about a Broadway orchestra experience, very much like the percussion one. Miller says, yeah, that maybe that's not a bad idea. And Sperling, who's eating his turkey sandwich, he says, well, what about me? And we look at Sperling and we go, why, are you interested? He said, I think it's a great idea. I would do it. And that's how the NYU Broadway Orchestra program came to be, eating turkey sandwiches and tuna fish in the lunchroom at Carroll's, just having a sort of, spitball session, thinking about, hey, what would happen if we did this and that? And lo and behold, I was able to fashion a program and hire both of them at NYU. And we started the orchestra 6 months later in September.
That's great. That's really cool. As far as the questions that people may have asked you or asked other people in these seminars, what do you think are like essential do's and don'ts for people that want to play percussion or drums in theater?
The do's or don'ts are, what do you want to do first? The do's or the don'ts?
How about the don'ts?
Don't be late. Don't show up not knowing your book better than the person whose book it is. Don't be a jerk. That's Miller's favorite, right? Don't be a jerk. Answer your phone calls, your emails immediately when you're asked to do something like this. And don't do something you can't do that's beyond your capability and experience. Do not. Because the worst thing you can do is you want to say yes to everybody who calls you. Hey, can you do this and do the show? And yes, I can do it. Because especially when you're young, you're fearless and you want to work. But you also have to be careful, and you have to be self-reflective enough to know that if you can't play congas like Giovanni Hidalgo, and that's what they need, that's the request, then do not say, yes, I can, when no, I can't. But if it's no, I can't, and you wish you could have said yes, then go study congas and bongos with somebody, including Giovanni Hidalgo, who could show you how to play like Giovanni Hidalgo. You get the point. The do's are much more fun. The number one that you want to do, that you want to be successful at, is you want to sound exactly to the best of your ability like the person who you are subbing for. You want to be, if you're playing a show that Clint Gannon is playing, you want to sound as though Clint Gannon is playing that show. They are not looking for substitutes to reinvent the books. Oh, I heard XYZ who's got the gig and I can play that better, or I can play that differently and I will show them how I think it goes. That falls under don't, but do sound as best you can exactly like that person. The greatest compliment that a substitute can get on Broadway is, oh, I thought you were the regular person. That is the best compliment that you can get. And when you get notes from the music director or the contractor or the other person who's playing the book and your sub, you intake those comments and you have a smile on your face and your thumb is in the upward direction, giving the high sign, yes, I understand. And yes, I will make those changes or improvements or whatever it is that they're asking to do, because you leave your ego at the door, the stage door, you hang it up, leave it with the stage door person. That's where the ego goes. This is if you want to come back. If you just want to do the show one time and put it on your resume, then come on in and show everybody that you know everything and it's better. And I'm being glib and don't mean to be, but I think we all get the message. I think those are your basic do's and don'ts.
If somebody's 21 years old, or say 22, just graduated from college, and they're moving to New York, say, I'm going to move to the big city, bright lights and skyscrapers and everything. And they get a place in Brooklyn, and they're like, I want to play Broadway shows. That's all I want to do is play Broadway shows. Uh, Mr. Haas, what do I need to know?
What do you need to know? That there is a 99.9% chance that that's not going to happen as you are dreaming of it happening. But it doesn't mean that it can't happen.
Now, what do you mean by that? It's interesting.
Well, what I mean by that is that it's probably not going to happen. You are a stranger in a strange city, correct? And in Brooklyn, and nobody knows who you are. So how would anybody know to contact you if they don't know who you are and they don't know where you live in Brooklyn and they don't know anything about your background? So as maybe silly as that sounds, that's what a 21-year-old may arrive in New York saying, all right, well, let's get to work. And nothing happens because they're looking at their cell phone going, I wonder when that's going to ring. Because the whole process of bringing yourself forward in this industry, there's no magic about it. There's a little bit of luck. If you do believe in luck, and I believe in it because I've been lucky, and sometimes I feel I've been unlucky. But be that as it may, there is, like anything in life, substantive things that one would have to do to begin to have an expectation of a successful career on Broadway. And it starts at the bottom. Rarely does it start at the top, although there are stories, of course. A music director went to school with his best buddy. His best buddy's great percussionist. The percussionist lives in Chicago. The friend now gets a break on Broadway, and they're going to open the show. And Miller calls up the MD, and the MD says, we're going to be using my drum set player who lives in Chicago. And Mr. Miller says, Roger Dodger, got that. That's what we're going to do. The Chicago drum set player moves to New York and plays the show that Miller hires him for. That is a very rare situation. That's the 0.1% that I mentioned in my 99.99% chance something's not going to happen. But there are fortunate individuals who have that story. So we can't completely say that doesn't exist, because it does. But someone completely from no connections, knows no one, sitting in Brooklyn, they have a lot of hard work in front of themselves. But if they're motivated enough, it's fulfilling, it's educational, and I would say that it's worthwhile and worthy as long as there is a good balance of always keeping what's reality, what really is going on, as compared to, well, I'm trying to live a fantasy. Because living a fantasy in New York, they're in all the songs that Frank Sinatra sang, and it's a tough place. And it's a tough place to come dream and not be willing to put in the hard work. But it's a great place to come and dream, and you put it in the hard work. And I guess my coda to my message is, most oftentimes, what you think is going to happen does not happen, but something else wonderful happens that you did not expect to have happen. Now that may be too convoluted, but that's my story, because so much of what I've had a fortune that's happened came my way without expecting it. And I've used the word before and I'll use it again, which is serendipity. It's something that happens that's wonderful, but you did not plan for it to happen. But tangentially, you were doing something that was the trigger or the opportunity, but you didn't know it.
Mm.
And New York is just so filled with everybody with those serendipitous stories where you found yourself at the right place at the right time with the goods that were needed. And that is a journey. It is not an instantaneous gratification moment. Never happened for me that way. Doesn't mean it can't for our listeners, but I think you're at the 0.1 percentile in terms of that being a possibility.
Man, deep.
Oh.
Yeah.
It actually has so much to do with being a great person, right? Nobody would have invited you if you just weren't a great guy and great to hang out with. The playing part of it, believe it or not, is a given. Because if you can't do the job, you'll get found out instantaneously. In fact, you can somehow talk your way or finagle your way onto a Broadway show. And on the first day of the first rehearsal, they can dismiss you. And it does happen where people, for whatever reason, but let's say in the context of what we're talking about, they don't have the goods. They don't know the form. They don't know the style. They don't know, but they said, yes, they did. Bye-bye. See you later. But your success was based on being collegial and being friendly, being connected, being available, and being able to do the job. That may sound like really simple tenets of, well, what do you need to do? But that's been for me a lifelong journey, along with, guess what, everybody? I've made so many mistakes in the things that I've done. I mean, I've made plenty of messes. What I mean by that, not on a stage and not on a show, but in the many aspects of the overall experience. I've learned from my mistakes, not from my successes. And sometimes, when I was younger, I once did a show as a sub, and I was kind of a jerk to the guy playing the drum set. I said something and it was sort of snarky. And guess what? I was done. Snarky, entitled, don't you know who I think I am? All that kind of stuff. You leave it at the stage door, gang, because it's not coming into the pit. It's not going on the stage, and nobody's buying that kind of stuff. So I think your story is a good one to tell and an important one, because your journey is very typical of, if you want to do it, this is what it's going to look like. Because you got to put in the time, and you got to get on the road and unpack and pack the suitcase 9,000 times and homesick. And am I going to eat every meal of my life in a Denny's? Oh my God. I mean, I like the milkshakes and the toasted cheese sandwich, but when I would go on tours, I'd gain so much weight because really all you had time to do was eat. Nowadays, I guess, people go jog and there's health clubs and hotels and stuff like that. But back in my day, it was pretty much you're going to pork up if you're not careful. And boy, did I.
I guess you could eat the cold noodle thing, but
they don't have cold noodles in Wichita. And nothing against Wichita. They should try thinking about that. But I spent enough time in small cities. It was Denny's. I'm telling you, I could tell you every fried egg special they had on those menus, with a chocolate milkshake, by the way, to wash it down.
Oh my God! Wow.
Before the bus loaded up and you had to leave.
So mistakes not to make. Don't go eat Denny's on the road, and make sure you stay out of the way of swords in the pit.
Oh my God, duck. No, that's all I can say is duck. If you're doing Pirates of Penzance, I'd wear my bicycle helmet now because I'm a bicycle rider. So
Oh, really?
yeah, that would have helped.
Do you ride in New York City on your
Every
bike?
day, every day.
Really?
Yep,
Okay.
yep.
Well, speaking of that, I'm gonna go do some exercising now.
There you
But I don't
go.
want I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know it's been an hour and a half, and I really appreciate the time that you took to chat. And it's good to get to know you and hear your story. And it's always great to hear from people who've done so much in their lives and have so much wisdom to share. And thank you once again.
My appreciation, Clayton, to you and to your listeners, because this is how we move the art form and our experience in our lives with listeners who will benefit from following what you're doing and the work that you're doing. So the appreciation goes back to you, and it's been a real honor and a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Haas. Hopefully, I get to meet you in person one day soon.
Look forward to it. Maybe on the ski hills in Aspen.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Bye.